He called me into the living room with a frown on his face. My mother sat beside him, her face expressionless. "You're old enough to fend for yourself now. We've done more than enough for you. It's time you learn to stand on your own." I looked to my mother, hoping for some sign of protest, hoping that, for once, she'd stand up for me. But she only looked away. At that moment, she was like a stranger. I left that night. No, kicked out. I remember begging them, even my sisters, but they ignored me.
"We never even liked you in the first place. Leave us alone."
You don't even look like us. You're so different. You clearly don't belong here with us.
You've reminded me of that father of yours since he died. I'm glad we're finally getting rid of you. Leave here.
So, with a few clothes stuffed into an old backpack and nowhere to go, I left. I wandered through the city, sleeping on park benches. I used to believe that family meant love, protection, and loyalty. I thought that no matter what, blood would bind us, keep us together. But looking back, I realized that's not how it went. Not in my house, anyway. My name is George, and I'm currently 28 years old. I have a beautiful family of my own. My lovely wife, Sarah, and our 2 kids who make us happy beyond measure. I'd promised myself to not put my kids through the same childhood I suffered, and I'm so glad I'm making it happen. Years ago, when my father was alive, things were different. He was the kind of man who'd ruffle my hair, pull me onto his lap, and tell me stories about heroes in distant lands. But he wasn't around long enough for me to hold on to more than those blurry, half-finished memories. I was only 6 when he died. A car accident, according to my mom, and leaving her to raise me alone. After his death, my mother changed. I don't know if it was grief or something deeper. She became distant, almost as if she blamed me for his absence. She rarely looked me in the eye, rarely spoke more than a few words to me. When she did, it was cold, dismissive, or outright irritated, as if the sight of me was a bitter reminder of the life she'd lost. Even then, I tried to love her. I tried to understand her silences, her empty looks. She was my mother, after all. And for a child, a mother's approval is everything. Then, when I was 9, she remarried. The man she brought home was charming enough at first, polite to her friends, and sweet to me. My mom and her husband ended up having 2 girls, and he showered them with attention, always calling them his little princesses. But with me, he never even bothered to pretend. The instant we were alone, he changed.
"You're nothing like your sisters. They're good girls, obedient and sweet. You're just a burden."
He'd say things like that over and over until I started believing them. My sisters were like fragile, delicate flowers to him, worthy of protection and affection. And I was a nuisance, nothing more. At first, I thought my mother would notice the way he treated me. I thought maybe she'd tell him to stop, that she'd protect me. But she was as blind to my suffering as she was to my existence. Whenever I tried to tell her, she'd just brush me off, her expression one of irritation.
Why do you always complain? You're so much like your father, always dramatic.
She always had a look that told me to keep quiet, that she was tired of hearing about my problems. I learned quickly to stop expecting anything from her. But it wasn't just the words. My stepfather made his contempt clear in other ways too. I remember one time during Christmas, I think it was. My stepsisters and I had been sitting by the tree, excitedly unwrapping our gifts. They each got beautiful dolls, clothes, toys that sparkled and gleamed. When it was my turn, my stepfather handed me a small, half-wrapped box with a smirk. Inside was a rough, ugly notebook and a pen that barely worked. I was so confused and hurt, but he just laughed.
"You should be grateful you got anything. I don't owe you a thing."
My mother didn't say a word. She just sat there, sipping her tea, as if my disappointment was invisible to her. It wasn't just the holidays, though. Every day was filled with small cruelties. While my sisters attended a private school, I went to the local public school, where resources were scarce and the classes were overcrowded. When I asked my mother why I couldn't go with my sisters, she shrugged.
Your stepfather thinks it's best this way. He's paying for it after all. Boys need to toughen up.
The irony was bitter. He wasn't my father, and he'd never treated me like a son. Yet he got to decide every aspect of my life while my mother just watched. I was the outsider, the one left on the fringes of my own family. When I didn't finish my chores fast enough, my stepfather's temper flared. Once he caught me washing dishes a little too slowly for his liking. He yanked me by the collar, his face filled with anger.
Are you useless? Is that why your father left you behind? Because you're worthless?
Those words cut deeper than any slap or shove. My father didn't leave me. He died. But at that moment, my stepfather's words felt like the truth. Like maybe, just maybe, I really was the problem. That night, as I lay in bed, the tears wouldn't stop. My sisters never faced his wrath. To him, they were precious and perfect. If they so much as shed a tear, he was there, comforting them, bringing them sweets or singing them to sleep. If I cried, he'd only laugh. My mother, though, was the one who hurt me the most. Not because she did anything directly, but because she allowed it all to happen. She'd see the bruises sometimes, the signs that he'd taken things too far, but she'd look away, pretending not to notice.
It's probably for the best. You should be grateful. Your father was a weakling and left you in this world. He's doing what your father couldn't do, so be appreciative and stop complaining.
At 13, I stopped asking for her protection. By then, I'd learned to endure the daily scorn, the indifference. I learned to be quiet, to stay out of their way. I did my best to be invisible, to shrink myself into something they wouldn't notice. But the worst of it came when I turned 16. I remember the day my stepfather decided I'd overstayed my welcome. He called me into the living room with a frown on his face. My mother sat beside him, her face expressionless.
You're old enough to fend for yourself now. We've done more than enough for you. It's time you learn to stand on your own.
I looked to my mother, hoping for some sign of protest, hoping that for once she'd stand up for me. But she only looked away. At that moment, she was like a stranger. I left that night. No, kicked out. I remember begging them, even my sisters, but they ignored me.
We never even liked you in the first place. Leave us alone.
You don't even look like us. You're so different. You clearly don't belong here with us.
You've reminded me of that father of yours since he died. I'm glad we're finally getting rid of you. Leave here.
So, with a few clothes stuffed into an old backpack and nowhere to go, I left. I wandered through the city, sleeping on park benches, doing whatever odd jobs I could find just to survive. I ate once a day, rationing every scrap I could afford. But there was one thing that kept me going, which was football. I always had a passion for football. It was the only thing I had left. The one place where I felt alive, where I could forget about the pain, the rejection, the loneliness. I trained every chance I got, pushing myself harder, faster, and eventually, my dedication paid off. I joined a local academy, one that didn't mind if you couldn't pay as long as you had the talent. When the scouts came, they saw potential. At 18, I was picked up by an agency, and from there, everything changed. I was super rich as a football star. Fame came fast, but it was my freedom that felt like the real victory. I no longer needed anyone, least of all the family that had cast me aside. By 23, I was a household name. People knew my face, cheered my name at matches, and treated me like a hero. I'd achieved everything I'd dreamed of, every success I'd once thought was impossible. I had fancy sports cars, mansions in 2 countries, and I was living my dream life. But then, out of nowhere, my past came back to haunt me. I remember the shock, the disbelief, as I watched the video of my mother and sisters accusing me of abandoning them. They painted me as a selfish son who had turned his back on his struggling family. The internet erupted in outrage, calling me a disgrace, a traitor. My heart pounded with anger and frustration. After everything they'd done to me, they still wanted to take from me, to twist my life into something ugly. I decided to confront them, to put an end to their lies once and for all. When I arrived at their house, it was almost unreal seeing them again, the faces that had once haunted my nightmares. My mother looked older. My sisters, both pregnant, looked at me with shame and embarrassment.
We were desperate, George. That stupid stepfather of yours left us in ruins. He got a new girlfriend and fled. I had no choice.
She'd had plenty of choices. She chose to let him hurt me, to ignore my pleas, to turn her back on me time and again. I pitied them, though. Maybe that was my mistake. For a moment, I allowed myself to feel the bond that once existed, the remnants of a family that never truly was. I left them with some money and a promise to visit in my free time. But it wasn't enough for them. The very next day, they posted another video, accusing me of trying to silence them with threats. When I visited again that day to confront them for the second time, they demanded $10 million if I wanted them off my back. I knew I had to end it. So, I played along, told them I'd pay if they recorded a final video telling the truth. They agreed, thinking they'd won. They posted the confession, and I released the audio recording of our deal. The world saw them for who they truly were. People threatened to storm their house. They couldn't step out of the house because there was always someone who would recognize them and cuss at them for their wickedness. In the end, they had to flee to my grandmother's old house, hiding from the anger they'd stirred. Unfortunately for them, once people noticed they had fled, they burned their house, causing my mom to lose everything. They tried to contact me several times so I could speak to the public, but I refused. They deserved everything they were getting. My mother got depression and anxiety, her guilt consuming her until it took her life 1 year later. My sisters were left to pick up the pieces of their broken lives. The eldest one had lost her baby in childbirth. The complications had left her with injuries that confined her to the floor, crawling because she couldn't afford a wheelchair. My youngest sister faced her own hardships. She tried to find work, but was turned away from most jobs once people recognized her face. The rumors followed her, the disgrace of their actions clinging like a shadow. Her son grew up in poverty, without comfort or protection. I later heard rumors that my stepfather had fled with a mafia boss's money from a deal they made, and 2 masked men had broken into his house and kidnapped him. He hasn't been found since. For years, they were haunted by the choices they'd made, but they never reached out to me again. There were moments I thought of them, wondered if I could have forgiven them, tried to offer some kind of peace, but the damage was done. Eventually, I found my own peace. I married my wife, started a family, and devoted myself to the sport that had saved me. My new family became my true home, a place where love wasn't conditional or weaponized. Now, I don't look back in anger or regret. I look back in understanding. I know who I am, what I endured, and what I became in spite of it all. Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe and leave a comment down below saying I subscribed, and we will try our best to reply to your comment.